Like Thomas said, one of the cool things that he mentioned is the fact that I haven't actually gotten a whole ton of experience speaking in front of crowds, but kind of how I learned how to give a presentation was more in smaller groups. So it is possible. I know it's tough sometimes to imagine being a public speaker in the sense that you're like, oh, when am I ever going to actually talk in front of a class? Or when am I going to get a chance to do that? And with the mentality of practice makes perfect, sometimes it's tough. You're like, I don't get any practice. But I actually gained the skills that I got from giving a presentation with a small group of people, so families, and that's kind of how I learned how to give a presentation and have the confidence and communication skills that I'm now applying to public speaking. But real quick, with public speaking, I want to talk about some other fears that we have, because obviously we talked about earlier how a lot of us get pretty nervous when we try to imagine being in front of people. So I'm going to go through 10 of the top fears that people have. So the first one, or the 10th one, is fear of thunder and lightning. So it only affects about 2% of people, so not a huge deal. Then we've got fear of open spaces, which is kind of random. I've never been really scared in an open field, but apparently some people are terrified when they get out in the open. And Thomas has passed around a little questionnaire you guys can take notes on. This part doesn't necessarily have notes, but we'll get there. The next part is claustrophobia. A few more of you guys have experienced this. Obviously, in this sort of situation, I think most of us would be quite afraid. But people who really experience claustrophobia start hyperventilating in elevators. So that's a whole nother thing. And that affects about 2.5%. Then we got fear of flying. I don't know how many of you guys have spent a lot of time in a plane, but I've spent many flights over 12 or 13 hours in a plane. But some people are very afraid of flying. I know one of the scariest experiences I had flying was landing while I was asleep. So I didn't really know what was going on because I was half asleep, but all of a sudden the world was crashing and I woke up in a plane. So I was like, okay, I get it. The other thing is sociophobia. This is being afraid of social interactions. It's also known as social anxiety disorder. And I feel like most people have this to a degree, not necessarily completely petrified of talking to people. But like Thomas mentioned, I was definitely afraid of approaching people when I was younger, and that's something I'm still working on. Next one is fear of heights. A lot of us feel this often. Obviously, these guys aren't very afraid of heights. I love these photos. I don't know if you've seen the ones with the guys like eating lunch on the steel structures, but I thought that was awesome. But it's still only 10% of people are really affected by heights. Next is fear of darkness. I put a little cat joke in here. It's always good to put in presentations. Just kidding. So 11%. Then we got fear of spiders. This jumps quite a bit from some of you guys who are already kind of queasy just seeing the picture. 30% of people have arachnophobia. And then it's fear of death, necrophobia, which is about 68%. And then one of the number one fears is actually the fear of public speaking, which is about 74% of people are afraid. And if you think about it, while I was preparing for this, I kind of thought through like, why are we so afraid of these social interactions or public speaking? But we're really like one of the only organisms that's really figured out communication. And it's such a big part of our social structure as humans. So if you're thinking about this one key factor of our humanity, and then all of a sudden you're in front of a bunch of people and trying to communicate with them, and you have that judgment, that's kind of where I saw like, ooh, I can see how innately we can be afraid because of the way that we're built. But really, why are we afraid? I just want you guys to think kind of, there's a section on your little notes where you can put down 2-3 things about like, why would you be afraid of talking in front of people? And we imagined earlier, Thomas did a great job of kind of painting a picture of what it would be like being in front of everyone. Everyone's staring at you, completely quiet. But what about that experience is scary? What about that makes you nervous? Let's write a couple things down real quick. Anybody want to share something that they thought of? As far as like why you would be afraid to get in front of a large crowd? Imagine 100 people, 500 people. What about that is scary? Anybody? Gabby?
If you're not prepared.
Not prepared? That's fear of failure, right? You know, like if you're not ready. Fear of the unknown. Yeah. Anyone else? Yep.
Being
Criticize. Judgment. Definitely. Amy?
That's kind of like mine. Like the more people there are, the more people might judge you.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, I want to go through a couple steps. I actually have 10 steps to an awesome presentation. First off, this is kind of not part of the presentation, but dress for success. Dress nice. Obviously, the first thing people notice about you is how you look, how you carry yourself. We'll talk about more like how you carry yourself later. And then there's always the success baby. Very handy in presentations. He's very cool. The next one is knowing what you're talking about. So this is like being familiar with your material. And I'm not just saying like kind of having a vague idea, but all of us have something that we're passionate about, whether it's like motorcycles, whether it's Pokemon, whether it's hair products, whatever it is. You know, there's one thing that you can talk about for like an hour, just straight, because you love it. I'm a film major. I love camera stuff. I can talk about that forever. But if you imagine like giving a public speech or talking in front of people, what if you were talking about that thing that you know everything about? How much easier would it be to go on for 30 minutes about it, right? So essentially, you can write out exactly what you're going to say ahead of time. So not only are you going to research it, but then you're going to write everything out so you know it so well that when you get up in front of people, it's just kind of natural. But the trick with writing it out is not to write it out and have like 4 pages of notes and carry it with you up in front of people and try to read off those notes. Essentially, the goal is to write as detailed as possible beforehand, and then you review it, you read it, go through it multiple times, and then when you get up front, you kind of almost ditch the notes. You know, you can have bullet points, you can have your PowerPoint, but you're going to go from what you know and what you've learned. Because I know personally, a lot of times if I have too many notes, I get distracted, I get off track because I was like, wait, I was supposed to say this thing. I know it's somewhere in my notes. I'm sitting there reading instead of engaging with the audience. The other point is practicing multiple times, getting up front, talking alone in your bedroom, doing it. I was doing this last night. Thomas was practicing his part earlier this afternoon. It was great. Just because a lot of times you can read something, but saying it is completely different. You know, how you say something makes a big impact on the audience. So practicing it multiple times and really just like avoid the fillers of, you know, ums, likes, those kind of things. It's basically filling the dead space in your talk. So obviously if you've practiced it, you know it, then you're not going to feel uncomfortable with the fillers. And the other way to do that is just get comfortable with like the dead space. Because pauses in a presentation are normal. But sometimes we feel like we need to put ums and likes and whatever in there. And then lastly, keep your points short and simple. So obviously, like I was saying, with the writing it all out, you're not going to write it out and then put it on your PowerPoint. You've all had classes where professors put way too much on the PowerPoint. You're sitting there like, ah! They're not even paying attention to you. They're just looking at all these points you've got up there. Next thing, control your voice. So you don't want to just talk with the same tone the whole time and go back and forth and go through the same monotone voice. You got to have inflection. You got to control it. These are some things you can control with pitch, tone, volume, and speed. Obviously volume, right? If you have a big class and you're not talking loud enough, the whole point of your presentation doesn't really work. Or if there's a point you're trying to make, you can change all these different things and kind of control. It's really trying to engage the audience, control their emotion. So based on what you're talking about, the speed. Speed is another thing that we often have a mistake with when we get nervous. We start talking way too fast. People can't understand what you're saying. So next thing is mixing up those speech patterns. So it's not good to be loud the whole time, or fast the whole time, or slow the whole time, but it's mixing it up. That's what keeps people listening. That's what keeps it interesting, because it's not just the same monotone voice the entire time. Number 3, use your body. You got to explain. Use hand motions. Walk around. Eye contact. I don't know if you guys have ever been in a big lecture hall, and you have like the person way in front of everybody, like make eye contact with you, and you're just like, whoa, he's talking to me, right? You have that same power when you're talking to people in your audience, and you can look off. I don't know if you ever had a presenter that was just kind of looking somewhere. You couldn't tell where they were looking, but they were just kind of trying to present, and they were avoiding the eye contact because the eye contact kind of put pressure on them that made them nervous. Same thing we covered last week with the art of listening. The same importance of eye contact when you're listening to someone applies when you're giving a presentation. Even though there's hundreds of people, you can maintain eye contact with one person and kind of hit that point. Next thing is smiling and making expressions. You know, obviously people are smiling, people are happy. You want to make expressions based on what you're talking about. And it's really based on the emotions you're conveying with your story. And just don't be weird. You know, that's sometimes tougher for some of us. But just go through, and once you've practiced it by yourself, and then wrote it all out, it's a little bit easier to be natural and not be weird. The next thing is act out your action verbs. So obviously if you're going to use a verb like running, sometimes it's really fun if you're telling a story about someone running. If you're acting it out, that's what you kind of do with your hands. Because a lot of people are like, oh, I know I need to make hand motions, but what do I do with my hands? And you say, what? Make the what? So just kind of work through your presentation and look at those key action words, and you can almost plan out how you're going to act based on what you wrote in your presentation. And then be yourself. That's the opposite of being weird, except some of us are weird. But really, people can see right through when you're fake and you're trying to put on a show. If you're not really excited, don't just jump around and try to get all excited for the audience. Do your best. You know, try to control the audience, get them excited, but don't be fake. Next point is moving around. I've been doing some of this already, but some of you guys have had all sorts of lecture halls with aisles and stuff where they'll actually walk down the aisle and come through and talk to you guys. It makes a big difference, like how close you are to someone, especially if like someone's sleeping or someone's not listening. It makes a big difference. If they're not paying attention, you bring them back in. If they're talking in the background, it kind of helps them maintain focus because you're kind of controlling where their eyes are, which is kind of fun too. You can play with it. You know, take their focus away from the PowerPoint and start changing it behind their back, which is kind of fun. And then using visual aids, obviously the PowerPoint here is a very good example. You want to explain what you're talking about visually, because people can't necessarily stay focused for very long if they're just listening to your words. Now, if you do choose to use a whiteboard, be really specific or really careful with what you write and really intentional about it, because personally, my handwriting sucks. And if you write like a whole sentence up there, you know how long it takes to write on a whiteboard? And this is part of that practicing part. Hopefully, if you've practiced it, you've realized, wow, like I was planning to write that sentence on the board, didn't realize that was going to take me 30 seconds just for my sentence. Avoid cluttered visuals is the next one. Obviously, your PowerPoint's going to have all sorts of pictures and all sorts of points. But if people don't get it, if you can't bring them into focus, you can't take their focus on something that matters and bring it in, then what's the point of the clutter? And then the last thing is don't read directly off your slides. So all of us have seen someone that's just kind of looking to the side, trying to bounce back and forth between you and the audience, or between the audience and the board. And it's just not as effective, especially at engaging the audience. What's one way that we can engage the audience? Anybody have an idea? Could be?
Ask questions.
Ask questions. Success, baby. Just kidding. Invoking the audience's imagination is another one. Obviously, we did that earlier, having you guys imagine, being behind the curtains up on stage. You can kind of feel the heat of the lights coming through the curtain. You're sitting there listening to someone announce who's going to be next, and it's you. And you're practicing your note cards, and then they announce you. There's no cheering, there's no clapping, there's nothing. You're just silently walking, click, 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 all the way up to the microphone that's like in the middle of this enormous stage, and all you see is lights. Makes a difference if you can get them to imagine it, get them to be part of your story. Obviously, purposeful distractions. There's plenty of distractions you can have, but a really good purposeful distraction is like taking their mind off something that's naturally distracting, like your PowerPoint. If you're wanting to talk to them, especially if you're trying to make eye contact, or talking about something specifically emotional, you can take their focus off the PowerPoint and on you by having these little blank slide things, which is really fun. I love them. Telling stories. We've been doing this already. Obviously, stories, what do people remember from a talk? Do you remember like the 5 key points? Or do you remember the cool story they told you, right? Stories help reiterate points in the sense that we talked about it earlier. I mean, Whitney, you mentioned with the art of listening. When we're in a one-on-one conversation, you want to reiterate what they said back to them. Instead of necessarily responding or changing the topic, you reiterate. Now, does anyone know why you do that in a personal conversation? Yeah?
Because it lets the person that's talking know that you're listening, you understand what they're saying.
Exactly. Anyone been texting and the other person didn't really understand what you texted, right? It's because words have many, many meanings. And how you say the words, the way your body is, your tone of voice make a big difference. So obviously, if you're talking to someone one-on-one and they say something to you, you're almost like showing them, hey, I get it. And you're also helping yourself in the sense that like, oh, is this what you meant? So when you're in an audience, kind of the same thing applies. Because you're talking to an audience, you want to make sure they understand what you mean. Because you could say a point and you think you're talking about this thing and the audience is way over here. They don't have any idea what you're talking about, or at least it's a completely different idea than what you attend. So when you come at it from a different angle, you tell a story to reiterate the point, it kind of brings them back in and makes sure, okay, we're on the same page, right? Stories are also helpful for remembering facts. We talked about this earlier. If you can especially incorporate facts into a specific story, that's what they're going to remember. Also a great chance to incorporate humor. Like there's this one story I heard. This guy, really long time ago, really far away, he was, I think some sort of royal family, but his birth was kind of mixed up. I think his mom died during it, so he kind of got split up from his family, didn't really know who his parents were, kind of lived his own life. And as he grew up, he fell in love with this girl and really just didn't know that she was his sister. Just jokes. But yes, repeat yourself is the next point. So with repeating yourself, we've talked about how to use stories to repeat yourself, but just straight up repeating what you said over and over and over and over again can make a really big difference. Saying your same points will help people remember it. Other than telling a story, it's just kind of like hitting them over and over again with that one point. And you don't just say it back or all at once, but throughout your presentation. If you have one key point you're trying to make, you spread it out, repeat it. Paraphrasing, we talked about this earlier with the storytelling. Storytelling is one way to paraphrase. Next point is stories. And then the last thing is, I don't know if you guys have heard this, but some people say you got to tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them what you told them. It's like the the default of like any presentation is you have like your key points and you go like, okay guys, today we're going to talk about this, this, this. And then you talk about this, this, this. And then when you're done, you'll be like, cool, well, we talked about this, this, this. It's repeating it. It's making sure they understand those key points that are most important to your presentation. Then knowing the room. This is something that I didn't necessarily think about all the time. Showing up early, right? Kind of testing your equipment. A lot of times, I don't know if you guys have had a presentation where you're there last minute trying to get your PowerPoint loaded. What does that do to your emotions? When you're like, last minute, oh, is this going to work? Is it not going to work? Builds up that stress level. And how well do you do at your presentation when you're really, really stressed and freaked out? Not so good. So knowing the room, and not just in the preparation sense, but like meeting people. And one cool example is like, I showed up early, I set up my like computer here, so I don't have to look around and look at the back. Some of you think I memorized everything, but you can kind of set up the room, you can figure out what's going to work best for you. You can kind of plan out, okay, well, how am I most comfortable? You can see where you're going to walk. But with meeting people, we talked about this 2 weeks ago in the Art of Happiness. Who was at the Art of Happiness talk? Awesome. So basically we talked about autonomy, then something else, then we talked about competency. But what was the middle thing other than autonomy and competency? Anyone remember? Connectedness? Relatedness? It was like how related you feel, connected you feel. So it's like friendships. So if you're in part of any sort of on-campus organization, any class, if you know the people there, you're happier, you feel more connected. So same thing in a presentation. If you kind of spend the time in the beginning, meet the people, you know everyone in your audience, how much easier would it be? Because people that you don't know judging you and people that like you're kind of like, oh yeah, I know they accept me, they know me. And also, a lot of us are going to be giving like business presentations, not necessarily huge crowds, but either you're selling a product or making some sort of presentation. What difference does it make if your audience knows you? If you take the time before your presentation to one-on-one and go greet the people that are going to be listening to, right? They'll understand you, they'll know you, they'll, oh, that's a cool guy. And you kind of like make up for some mistakes you might make. And then gauging the audience obviously is really important. Knowing when to move on if you're kind of making a point that they understand, or if they really don't get it, people are looking at you funny, you might want to reiterate. You might want to tell a story about it. So you're always kind of gauging the audience, seeing if you need to walk around, if you need to make eye contact with someone specific to get them to pay attention. That's kind of what you're gauging. And then 10, relax. Real easy. Everybody breathe in. Ready? Imagine like a limp noodle. Limp noodle. Right? And obviously you're not going to stop your presentation and do that yourself, but when you're waiting for it, right? I know a lot of times I'm just cramming at the end, and I'm spending my last 5 minutes like going over my notes, going over my notes. But really, what good is that going to do to read your notes 5 more times in the last 2 seconds? Instead, you can sit there and spend your time relaxing and mentally preparing, emotionally preparing for what you're about to do. It's really, how much do people comprehend out of what we say that's just words? You know, the words is a very little part of what they understand. Most of it is your tone of voice and your body language. So if you're focusing so hard on your words that you don't think about your tone of voice or your body language, you're, like we talked about earlier, you can completely communicate the wrong thing and say all the right words. Also with relaxing is that your audience wants you to do well. They do. I don't know if you've watched someone do really terribly in front, but you're sitting there like, you can do it. You got this. Right? You're just like, come on, you got it. Not so nervous. Also, nobody knows if you screw up. Who knows if I even hit all my points? I might have done something completely wrong, but you have no idea. So that's awesome. The other thing is 10 years from now, it won't matter, right? No one's going to care. I mean, there's certain situations, you know, if you're like Miss Universe and you totally make a wrong answer. I've seen a lot of those YouTube videos. I have a friend who was on The Price is Right, and she said $1,000 instead of $1,000. She said $1,000, and that's kind of in front of, you know, a national TV audience. And obviously that's something that might matter in 10 years, but it's going to sure be really funny in 10 years. So anything you make a mistake with in your presentation, it's not necessarily going to be a huge deal in the end. So what did I tell you? Let's try to go through some of the points. Anyone know one of them? Don't look at your notes. Just call them out. What's one thing? Relax. Sweet.
Know your material.
Know your material. Move around.
Know the room.
Know the room. You got it. That's right. What? Eye contact? Yep. Awesome.
Control your voice.
Control your voice. Anything else? Tell stories.
Dress for success.
Oh, dress for success. That was like the bonus 11th point. But yes, awesome, Gabby. There's also repeat yourself, but here's all of them. Engaging the audience, using visuals, using your body, controlling your voice. All those things work together, make a good presentation.